Some people can stand beside a Rolls Royce, and still feel completely abandoned. Rain hammered the empty service road outside Terminal C just after 2:13 in the morning, turning the airport lights into long rivers of gold across the wet pavement. The storm had delayed nearly every outbound flight in Chicago, and the exhausted hum of jet engines rolled through the darkness like distant thunder. Ethan Cole pulled his hood tighter as he stepped out of the maintenance hangar carrying a metal toolbox in one hand and a paper bag holding the leftovers he planned to bring home to his daughter. His back ached from 14 straight hours repairing baggage lifts and hydraulic carts, but exhaustion had become part of him years ago, like the old wedding ring he still wore on a chain beneath his shirt. He was halfway to the employee parking lot when headlights cut through the rain. A black Rolls Royce sat parked alone near the edge of the restricted service lane, its polished body glowing beneath the runway lights like something that belonged in another world entirely. Ethan slowed. Expensive cars didn't stop there. Not at that hour. Not during a storm. Then he saw her. A woman stood beside the passenger door with her arms wrapped around herself, her dark coat soaked through by the rain. Her blonde hair clung to her cheeks, and even from 30 feet away, Ethan could see she was crying hard enough to shake. One airport security guard approached with visible annoyance, flashlight bouncing against the pavement. "Ma'am, you can't stay here," he snapped. "This area's restricted." She nodded once but didn't move. The guard sighed impatiently. "Look, if you're waiting for somebody, you need to move the vehicle." Ethan kept walking for another few steps. He should have gone home. Lily would already be asleep on the couch waiting for him again, pretending she hadn't promised herself she'd stay awake. But then the woman lowered her head, and the sound she made wasn't dramatic or loud. It was small. Broken. The kind of sound people make when they think nobody cares enough to listen. Ethan stopped. Quietly, he walked toward them. "She okay?" he asked. The guard shrugged. "No idea. But she can't be here." Ethan looked at the woman. Up close, she looked elegant even soaked in rainwater, but her mascara had streaked beneath tired gray eyes, and there was something strangely empty about the way she stared at the ground. Not angry. Not spoiled. Just tired in a way money could never fix. Ethan slowly removed his old canvas jacket and held it toward her. "You're freezing," he said softly. She blinked in surprise. "I'm fine." "No," Ethan replied gently. "You're really not." For a second, neither of them moved. Rain tapped against the Rolls Royce roof. A jet roared somewhere above the clouds. The woman finally accepted the jacket with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. The guard checked his watch impatiently. "Sir, you know her?" Ethan shook his head. Nobody should stand alone in weather like this. The woman looked at him then. Really looked at him. At the grease stains on his work boots. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The quiet calm in his voice. Something in her expression shifted, almost like she had forgotten men like him still existed. Ethan glanced toward the open trunk of the Rolls Royce, expecting luggage. Instead, he froze. Inside rested a navy blue pilot jacket embroidered with silver wings and the unmistakable gold crest of Laurent Sky's Airlines. The woman stared at the pilot jacket inside the trunk for half a second too long before quietly lowering the lid. Whatever emotion had cracked open inside her moments earlier disappeared behind practiced control, the kind worn by people who had spent years hiding pain beneath polished smiles and expensive clothing. Ethan noticed it immediately. He had seen that look before in airport terminals, military hangars, and hospital waiting rooms. People pretending they were holding together because they were afraid of what might happen if they stopped. The rain softened slightly as another gust of cold wind swept across the tarmac. "There is a coffee place still open near baggage claim," Ethan said carefully. "Nothing fancy. But it is warm." She hesitated. "I should probably leave." "Probably," Ethan replied. But you do not look ready yet. For the first time that night, the corner of her mouth moved like she almost smiled. Almost. 10 minutes later they sat inside a nearly empty airport cafe lit by tired fluorescent lights and the dull blue glow of vending machines. A college kid behind the counter wiped espresso cups while half listening to music through one earbud. Somewhere overhead, a delayed boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Ethan wrapped both hands around a paper cup of black coffee while the woman sat across from him wearing his oversized canvas jacket over her soaked clothes. It hung loosely around her shoulders like something softer than luxury had touched her for the first time in years. So, Ethan said quietly, "What should I call you?" She looked down at the steam rising from her tea. "Claire." Ethan nodded once, though something in her pause told him the name was not real. Still, he did not push. Dignity meant allowing people their silence until they were ready to trust you with the truth. "You work here?" she asked. "Maintenance. Night shift?" "Mostly." She glanced toward his hands resting against the coffee cup. Grease stains still lined his knuckles despite the rain. "You look more tired than the airport does." Ethan laughed softly through his nose. "That bad, huh?" "A little." For a moment they simply listened to the hum of the terminal around them. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past the glass windows. A child cried somewhere near security. Outside, runway lights blinked through the storm like lonely stars. Then Claire spoke again. "If you had all the money in the world," she asked quietly, "what would you do with it?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Most people would have said something grand. Big house. Beaches. Cars. Freedom. But exhaustion has a way of stripping a person down to the truth. He stared into his coffee for a moment before answering. "I would sleep," he said softly. "Just one full night without worrying about bills or whether my daughter notices when I skip dinner so she can eat more." Claire looked at him sharply then, like his honesty had reached somewhere she had spent years trying to lock shut. Her eyes shimmered again. "That is it?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Peace is expensive these days." She let out a small breath that almost sounded like heartbreak. Ethan noticed the expensive watch beneath her sleeve. The diamond earrings she had forgotten to remove. The way people passing the cafe occasionally glanced toward her with faint recognition before second-guessing themselves. But none of it matched the sadness in her eyes. "You ever feel lonely in a crowded place?" she asked suddenly. Ethan looked around the giant terminal. Hundreds of people moved through it every hour. Most never really seeing each other at all. "Every day," he answered. Claire lowered her gaze to the tea trembling gently between her hands. Then very quietly, almost too quietly to hear above the storm outside, she whispered, "Me too." By the time Ethan finally pulled into the narrow gravel driveway outside his small duplex on the edge of Aurora, the storm had weakened into a cold drizzle that tapped softly against the windshield of his aging Ford pickup. The dashboard clock glowed 3:41 in pale green numbers. Most of the neighborhood was dark except for one porch light still burning beside his front door. Ethan smiled tiredly the moment he saw it. Lily again. She always left the light on when she was trying to stay awake for him. He stepped quietly inside, careful not to let the screen door slam. The house smelled faintly of tomato soup and crayons. Their little living room was cramped but warm, filled with second-hand furniture, stacks of library books, and drawings taped unevenly across the walls. Most of them were airplanes. Some were crooked. Some had glitter glued to the wings. Every single one had the same tiny signature at the bottom. Lily Cole. Ethan found her curled sideways on the couch beneath a faded blue blanket, fast asleep with colored pencils scattered around her lap. The television played softly with the volume almost muted. A cartoon airplane moved silently across the screen while rain whispered against the windows. Ethan knelt beside her carefully. "Hey, Peanut," he whispered. "You tried to wait up again." Lily stirred slightly, her blonde curls falling across her face. "Daddy?" "Yeah." Her sleepy blue eyes opened halfway. "You are late." Ethan smiled gently. "Storm messed up half the airport." She sat up slowly, rubbing one eye before suddenly remembering something. "Wait." She reached for a folded piece of paper beside the couch cushion. "I made this for you." Ethan unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing done mostly in blue marker and silver crayon. A large airplane soared through bright yellow clouds while beneath it stood a man holding the hand of a little girl. Above the plane, written in crooked letters, were the words, "Someday you will fly again, Daddy." Ethan stared at the picture longer than Lily realized. Something quiet moved through his chest, old and aching and familiar. "You like it?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded once. "I love it." Lily smiled proudly before pointing at the airplane. "That one is yours." "Mine?" "Uh-huh." She yawned. "Because you know how to fix them better than anybody." Ethan looked away for a second toward the dark kitchen. "Not anymore." Lily frowned the way children do when adults say things that make no sense. "You still do." Her voice softened sleepily. "You just fix the little parts now." Ethan swallowed hard. Children had a strange way of finding truth adults spent years trying to bury. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Come on. Bedtime." A few minutes later, after carrying her to her room, Ethan stood quietly in the doorway watching her sleep beneath glow in the dark stars stuck across the ceiling. Beside her bed sat a small model airplane they had built together 3 summers ago before overtime shifts and unpaid bills slowly replaced weekends. He remembered another life then. A cleaner uniform. Military hangars before sunrise. The roar of engines beneath his hands. The feeling of purpose before grief had reduced everything down to survival. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned off the bedroom light. But before he closed the door completely, Lily spoke again through the darkness. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "The sky still misses you." Ethan stood still for a long moment after that. Then quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "Maybe." The next afternoon the airport buzzed with the restless energy that always followed a night of cancelled flights and delayed departures. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed overhead every few minutes. Travelers rushed past one another carrying coffee cups, neck pillows, and the quiet exhaustion of modern life. Ethan stood near Gate 14 repairing the loose wool assembly on a baggage cart while a cold October wind pushed through the automatic terminal doors each time someone entered. His knees ached from crouching on concrete since sunrise, but he kept working steadily, tightening bolts with the calm precision of someone who respected even the jobs nobody noticed. Across the terminal, a little old woman struggled to drag 2 oversized suitcases while balancing a cane beneath one arm. Most people walked around her without slowing down. Some barely looked up from their phones. Ethan noticed immediately. He always did. Without a word, he set down his tools and crossed the terminal. "Ma'am," he said gently, "let me help you with those." The woman looked relieved enough to cry. "Oh, thank heavens. They told me my gate changed again and I cannot walk much farther." Ethan lifted both suitcases like they weighed nothing. "What gate?" 32. Ethan smiled faintly. "That is practically another zip code." She laughed softly despite herself, and together they moved slowly through the crowded terminal. A few yards away, standing near a large window overlooking the runways, Claire watched the entire thing silently beneath oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored coat. She had returned to the airport that morning for reasons she still could not fully explain to herself. Officially, she was there to review storm damage reports and delayed operations. Unofficially, she had spent the last 12 hours thinking about a tired maintenance worker who spoke more honestly in 5 minutes than most executives did in 5 years. She watched Ethan guide the elderly woman carefully onto an airport shuttle cart before helping adjust the blanket over her knees. He never once looked impatient. Never once checked whether anyone was watching. He simply treated her with the kind of dignity that had become painfully rare in wealthy places. Claire felt something tighten quietly inside her chest. "Ethan," a sharp voice barked across the terminal. Ethan turned. Rick Donnelly, one of the airport operations supervisors, strode toward him carrying a clipboard and irritation like it was part of his uniform. "What are you doing?" Rick snapped. "Cart repairs are backed up and now I find you playing chauffeur?" Several nearby employees glanced over immediately. Ethan stayed calm. "She needed help." Rick scoffed loudly. "You are maintenance, not customer experience." The old woman frowned. "Young man, he was kind enough to help me when nobody else would." Rick forced a fake smile toward her. "Of course, ma'am. We appreciate that." Then he turned back to Ethan, voice lowering. "You want to keep this job, Cole? Then stop acting like some airport hero and get back downstairs where you belong." Silence settled awkwardly around them. Ethan simply nodded once. Understood. No anger. No argument. No pride. Just quiet restraint. Claire watched carefully from across the terminal. Most men would have snapped back. Most would have defended themselves. Ethan only picked up his toolbox and returned to work without another word. Rick shook his head dismissively and walked off. A businessman nearby muttered under his breath, "Guy probably thinks kindness pays the bills." Ethan heard him. Claire knew he did. But instead of reacting, Ethan noticed a little girl near the gate crying because she had dropped her stuffed rabbit beneath a row of seats. He crouched down, reached underneath, dusted it off carefully, and handed it back to her with a gentle smile. The child hugged the rabbit like he had returned treasure. Claire lowered her eyes then, suddenly unable to explain why the scene hurt her heart more than the argument had. Because somewhere between the private jets, executive meetings, and billion-dollar negotiations, she realized she had spent years surrounded by powerful people and almost none who carried quiet grace the way Ethan Cole did. That evening the airport settled into the strange in-between hour that belonged neither to day nor night. Business travelers hurried toward red-eye departures while exhausted families slept across rows of connected seats beneath the pale glow of terminal lights. Outside, the storm clouds had finally broken apart, revealing a cold silver moon hanging above the runways. Deep inside Hangar 8, Ethan knelt beside an aging hydraulic loader with a wrench tucked into his back pocket and grease streaked across both hands. The hangar smelled like jet fuel, metal, and rain-soaked concrete. It was quiet there. Ethan preferred it that way. Machines made sense to him. People were harder. He tightened a pressure valve carefully, listening to the soft hiss of escaping air. Something still sounded wrong. Subtle. Almost invisible. Most technicians would have missed it entirely. Ethan did not. He leaned closer beneath the loader frame, adjusting a flashlight between his shoulder and jaw as his eyes traced the hydraulic line inch by inch. Then he saw it. A tiny stress fracture hidden near the connector housing. Dangerous if ignored. Catastrophic at 30,000 pounds of pressure. Ethan exhaled softly. There you are. Most mechanics would not have caught that. The voice startled him enough to make him sit upright quickly beneath the machine. Claire stood near the hangar entrance holding 2 cups of coffee, her cream coat replaced by a simple dark sweater and jeans that somehow made her look even less like the polished woman from the Rolls Royce. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected softly in her gray eyes as she walked toward him. Ethan wiped his hands with a rag. You should not be down here. This area is restricted. You say that like I have not heard it before. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Claire handed him a coffee cup. "You knew exactly where the fracture would be," she said carefully. "You barely even searched." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Hydraulic systems talk if you listen long enough." Claire studied him quietly. The calm precision in his movements. The way his fingers handled tools like extensions of memory rather than labor. She had spent years around aerospace engineers, military contractors, and elite aviation specialists. None of them moved the way Ethan did. "You worked on aircraft before this job," she said finally. Ethan looked back down at the machine. "Long time ago." "Military?" Silence lingered for a moment. Somewhere high above them, a departing jet thundered through the night sky. Ethan tightened another bolt before answering. "Air Force Maintenance Division." Claire blinked once. "Maintenance?" "Something like that." There it was again. The careful distance in his answers. Like a man deliberately making himself smaller than his past. Claire glanced toward the open workbench nearby where several old technical manuals sat stacked beneath a faded baseball cap. One paper partially slid from beneath the pile. Her eyes caught the heading immediately. Advanced Aviation Failure Analysis Unit. Below it was a certification seal she recognized instantly. Elite level. Rare. The kind issued to specialists trusted with military aircraft systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire looked back at Ethan slowly. "That is not standard maintenance training." Ethan followed her gaze and quietly slid the paper back beneath the manuals. "It does not matter anymore." "Maybe it should." He shook his head once. "People move on." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "You are telling me a man trained to diagnose advanced flight systems now spends his nights fixing baggage carts?" Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. "Baggage carts still matter to somebody." The answer hit her harder than she expected. Because he meant it. No bitterness. No self-pity. Just quiet acceptance wrapped in dignity. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. In her world, talented people fought desperately to be seen. To be praised. To be important. Ethan Cole seemed determined to disappear instead. Then suddenly alarms began flashing red across the far side of the hangar. A young technician rushed inside breathless. "We have a hydraulic failure warning on one of the overnight aircraft loaders," he shouted nervously. "Nobody can figure out what is triggering it." Ethan immediately stood. "Which unit?" "Loader 6 near gate 21. Ethan grabbed his flashlight without hesitation. Claire watched him stride across the hangar with calm purpose already returning to his eyes. And for the first time since meeting him, she realized something unsettling. The quiet maintenance worker everyone overlooked was not ordinary at all. The warning lights near gate 21 flashed in sharp red pulses across the wet loading platform while ground crews moved anxiously around the stalled aircraft loader. Rainwater shimmered beneath the floodlights and the cold night air carried the constant roar of jet engines preparing for departure. Two technicians stood near the disabled equipment arguing over diagnostic readings while Rick Donnelly barked impatient orders into a radio. "Reset the system again," Rick snapped. "We cannot delay another departure tonight." "We already tried that twice," one technician answered nervously. "The hydraulic pressure keeps dropping." Ethan stepped onto the platform beside them, flashlight already in hand. Claire followed several feet behind, unnoticed by most of the crew. The moment Ethan crouched beside the loader, the arguing stopped almost instinctively. Not because of authority. Because calm has a strange way of silencing chaos. Ethan listened carefully to the machine for several seconds without speaking. Then he pointed toward a narrow access panel near the rear stabilizer. "Pressure valve line," he said quietly. "Secondary seal is blown." One technician frowned. That sensor did not show any failure there. Ethan looked up calmly. Because the leak only happens under weight distribution. Rick folded his arms skeptically. And you figured that out in 10 seconds? Ethan stood slowly. No. I figured it out from the sound. Several workers exchanged doubtful glances. Rick let out a short laugh. Terrific. We have got an airplane whisperer now. Claire watched Ethan carefully. No reaction. No embarrassment. Just that same quiet restraint. Ethan removed the access panel himself and angled his flashlight into the housing unit. A thin stream of hydraulic fluid glistened beneath the metal connector exactly where he predicted. One of the technicians blinked in disbelief. How did you even see that? Ethan tightened the connector calmly. Because somebody replaced the wrong seal size last month. Silence followed. Even Rick stopped talking for a moment. Ethan continued working with smooth, efficient movements, his hands steady despite the cold rain dripping from the edge of the loader. Claire noticed something then that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. The exhaustion disappeared from him when he worked on aircraft systems. Beneath the worn maintenance uniform was a man who clearly belonged in this world more than anyone around him realized. Within minutes the warning lights shut off completely. The hydraulic pressure stabilized. One technician checked the monitor twice before staring at Ethan with open confusion. System is green, he said quietly. A nearby pilot exhaled in relief. Good. We are already 40 minutes behind schedule. Rick cleared his throat awkwardly. Fine. Good catch, Cole. It was the closest thing to praise Ethan had received all night. Ethan simply wiped his hands with a rag and stepped back from the loader. Run another pressure cycle before departure, he said. You should be good after that. Then suddenly movement stirred across the terminal windows overlooking the gate. Black SUVs rolled onto the private airport access road one after another, headlights reflecting against the rain-soaked pavement like a moving line of silver fire. Security personnel appeared almost immediately. Airport executives rushed across the terminal floor adjusting ties and jackets. Even Rick straightened his posture. One of the younger technicians whispered under his breath, "What is going on?" Claire lowered her eyes briefly like someone bracing for impact. Ethan noticed the shift instantly. The airport energy changed in seconds. Conversations hushed. Radios crackled faster. Somewhere near the terminal entrance, a group of reporters hurried through security checkpoints carrying cameras and microphones. Then a sharply dressed executive approached the platform in visible panic. Ms. Laurent just arrived, he announced breathlessly. Everybody stay professional. Ethan froze slightly at the name. Laurent. His eyes moved slowly toward Claire standing beneath the floodlights beside the loader. The rain had dampened strands of blonde hair against her face, but now her expression looked entirely different. Controlled. Distant. Powerful. A black umbrella appeared above her almost instantly as two security agents approached from behind. One lowered his head respectfully. The board is waiting for you upstairs, ma'am. Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. Claire finally looked back at him with something painfully close to regret in her eyes. Then very softly she said, "My real name is Vivian." The entire terminal seemed to change around Vivian Laurent the moment her real name entered the air. Executives hurried toward her with forced smiles and tablets pressed against their chests. Security agents moved into position near the elevators. Reporters gathered behind the glass walls outside like birds sensing a storm. Yet somehow, standing beneath the harsh floodlights of Gate 21, Vivian looked more exhausted than powerful. Ethan remained still beside the loader platform, rain dripping quietly from the edge of his sleeves. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The distance between a billionaire airline owner and a maintenance worker suddenly felt enormous, even though only minutes earlier they had shared coffee like strangers trying to survive loneliness together. "You own Laurent Skies," Ethan said finally. His voice stayed calm, but quieter now. Vivian nodded once. Yes. Ethan glanced toward the line of black SUVs waiting beyond the runway fence. You probably should have mentioned that. A faint sadness touched her expression. Would you have talked to me the same way if I had? Ethan did not answer immediately because honesty mattered too much to lie. Before he could respond, one of the executives approached hurriedly. Ms. Laurent, the board meeting cannot wait any longer. Another man leaned closer, lowering his voice nervously. There is also an issue with Flight 728. Vivian's expression sharpened instantly. What kind of issue? Hydraulic response irregularities during storm ascent simulations. Ethan looked up immediately at those words. The executive continued anxiously. Engineering says it is probably sensor interference from the weather, but the pilots are requesting additional review before departure. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Hydraulic irregularities. Storm conditions. Something about the combination bothered him instantly. Vivian noticed the shift in his face. What is it? Ethan hesitated. Which aircraft? Airbus A321, the executive answered impatiently. Flight to Seattle. Ethan wiped rainwater from his forehead slowly. How long has the warning been happening? 3 hours. And they still cleared boarding? The executive frowned defensively. Our engineers already checked the system. Ethan stared toward the distant terminal windows for a moment, thinking. Then quietly he asked, did the warning start after the storm delay inspection? The executive blinked. How did you know that? Ethan did not answer. He was already moving. Vivian watched him stride quickly toward the maintenance corridor leading into operations control. Ethan, she called after him. He stopped briefly. If the secondary hydraulic relay froze during cold pressure cycling, he said carefully, the system would clear itself temporarily during diagnostics but fail again under turbulent stress. Silence hit the group around him immediately. One senior engineer frowned. That would be almost impossible. Ethan met his eyes calmly. Almost. Then he disappeared through the terminal doors. Vivian followed without hesitation despite the executives protesting behind her. Inside operations control, giant weather radar screens glowed across dark walls while dispatchers spoke rapidly into headsets. Flight 728 blinked yellow on the departure monitor. Ethan moved straight toward the engineering console like a man walking through memory rather than uncertainty. One technician started to object. Sir, authorized personnel only. Vivian answered before Ethan could. He stays. The room fell silent instantly. Ethan pulled up the aircraft diagnostics and scanned the pressure readings with frightening speed. His eyes moved calmly across lines of data while several certified engineers stood frozen beside him. Then Ethan pointed toward one tiny fluctuation buried inside the hydraulic sequence. There. The lead engineer leaned closer. That reading is insignificant. No, Ethan replied softly. That reading is hiding the real failure. He adjusted the simulation manually. Suddenly warning alerts exploded across the monitor. The room froze. One dispatcher whispered under his breath, "Oh my God." The secondary relay pressure dropped exactly as Ethan predicted. In severe turbulence, the aircraft could have lost critical hydraulic responsiveness mid-flight. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Vivian stared at Ethan with open disbelief, but what shook her most was not his intelligence. It was how calm he remained while everyone else panicked. No pride. No arrogance. Just quiet focus. Ethan stepped back from the console. Ground the aircraft until the relay assembly is replaced, he said. Then rerun full cold weather cycling before departure. The lead engineer swallowed hard. You just caught something our entire department missed. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. People miss things when they are tired. And in that moment, standing beneath the dim blue glow of the operation screens, Vivian Laurent realized the quiet man everyone overlooked had just saved hundreds of lives without asking for recognition at all. The rain had finally stopped by dawn, leaving the airport wrapped in cold silver light as the first rays of morning crept across the runways. Inside Terminal A, exhausted passengers from Flight 728 sat waiting near the departure gate while technicians rushed through final inspections on the grounded aircraft. Rumors had already started spreading through the terminal. Some passengers whispered about mechanical problems. Others complained loudly about delays and missed meetings. But nobody knew how close the flight had come to disaster only hours earlier. Ethan stood quietly near a maintenance counter sipping stale coffee from a paper cup while reviewing equipment logs for the morning shift. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before. Same worn jacket. Same tired eyes. Same calm silence. If anyone passing through the terminal had looked at him, they would have assumed he was just another invisible airport worker trying to survive another long day. That was how Ethan preferred it. Across the terminal, reporters gathered near the executive concourse where Laurent Sky's officials prepared a public statement about the delayed flight. Cameras flashed beneath bright television lights while airport staff moved nervously between security lines. Rick Donnelly adjusted his tie repeatedly, trying to look important enough to belong near the executives. Then suddenly the terminal speakers chimed softly. Attention passengers and staff. Ms. Vivian Laurent will be making a brief statement near Gate 22. Conversations slowed almost immediately. Travelers lifted their heads. Employees paused beside luggage carts and coffee stands. Even the gate agent stopped typing. Ethan barely looked up at first. He expected another corporate apology about weather delays and passenger inconvenience. Nothing more. But then Vivian stepped onto the small platform near the boarding gate, and the entire terminal seemed to quiet itself around her. She wore a dark navy coat with her blonde hair pulled neatly back, every inch the composed billionaire executive the world expected her to be. Yet Ethan noticed something different in her eyes. They no longer looked empty. Vivian accepted the microphone from an assistant and glanced briefly across the crowd until her eyes found Ethan standing near the maintenance counter. Last night, she began softly, Laurent Sky's experienced a serious hydraulic system failure risk involving Flight 728. A ripple of concern moved through the crowd. Reporters immediately raised cameras. Vivian continued calmly. What could have become a tragedy was prevented because one person noticed what others missed. Ethan slowly lowered his coffee cup. Rick frowned in confusion nearby. Vivian turned fully toward Ethan now. A maintenance worker named Ethan Cole identified a hidden relay failure that escaped multiple inspections and engineering reviews. Silence spread through the terminal like a slow-moving wave. Employees turned toward Ethan one by one. Travelers followed their gaze. Even the reporters lowered their cameras slightly, curious now. Vivian stepped down from the platform and walked directly across the polished floor toward him. Her heels echoed softly through the stillness. The truth is, she said clearly enough for the entire terminal to hear, the safest person in this airport last night was not the executive team, the board members, or the engineers with titles. She stopped in front of Ethan. It was the man nobody noticed. Complete silence followed those words. Rick looked like someone had drained all color from his face. Several technicians who mocked Ethan the night before stared at the floor in embarrassment. One elderly passenger near the gate began quietly clapping. Then another joined. Within seconds applause spread across the terminal, not loud or explosive, but steady and sincere. Ethan looked deeply uncomfortable with the attention. Vivian noticed immediately. "You do not like recognition very much, do you?" she asked softly. Ethan gave the faintest shake of his head. "I was just doing my job." Vivian smiled sadly. "No, Ethan." Her voice lowered with genuine emotion. You were protecting people. For a moment neither of them spoke. Around them, the entire terminal remained strangely still, like everyone understood they were witnessing something rare. Not power. Not wealth. Something quieter. Something better. Then from somewhere behind the crowd came the small excited voice of a child. Daddy. Ethan turned just in time to see Lily running through the terminal with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She threw her arms around him tightly while several passengers smiled through tired eyes. Vivian watched the little girl hug her father like he was the safest place in the world. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire owner of an airline felt something she could not buy. Home. 3 days later the storm clouds were gone, replaced by a bright autumn sunrise stretching gold across the runways of O'Hare International Airport. Air traffic moved smoothly again. Boarding calls echoed through the terminals. Travelers hurried toward departures with coffee cups and carry-on luggage while jet engines rolled like distant thunder beneath the morning sky. But something inside Ethan Cole felt different now, though he could not quite explain why. Maybe it was the strange quiet that had followed Vivian's public statement. Maybe it was the way airport employees suddenly looked him in the eye instead of through him. Or maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in years, someone had truly seen him without asking him to become smaller first. Ethan stood near the employee parking lot helping Lily zip her little pink jacket against the cold morning wind. You really are going on an airplane today? She asked for at least the 5th time. Ethan smiled faintly. That is usually what boarding passes mean. Lily gasped dramatically. Like an actual airplane in the sky? Hopefully. Her excitement exploded into laughter so bright it almost hurt Ethan's heart. He had spent years surviving paycheck to paycheck, trying to protect her childhood from how fragile their world really was. Yet somehow, despite everything they lacked, she still believed life could surprise people with goodness. A sleek black SUV pulled quietly to the curb beside them. Ethan already knew who it was before the driver stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Vivian emerged wearing a long cream-colored coat as sunlight caught softly against her blonde hair. No reporters followed her today. No executives. No security rushing ahead to clear space. For once, she looked less like the owner of a billion-dollar airline and more like a woman finally breathing without pressure crushing her chest. Lily stared up at her wide-eyed. Wow, she whispered to Ethan. She looks like movie music. Vivian laughed softly at that, the sound warmer and more genuine than Ethan had ever heard from her before. I think that might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. Lily proudly held up her backpack covered in airplane stickers. Daddy said we are flying somewhere special. Vivian glanced toward Ethan carefully. Only if you both still want to. Ethan studied her quietly for a moment. 3 nights earlier she had stood crying beside a Rolls Royce looking like someone lost inside her own life. Now there was softness in her expression. Peace, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Where are we going? Ethan finally asked. Vivian looked toward the runway where one silver Laurent Sky's jet waited beneath the morning sun. Somewhere quiet, she answered softly. Somewhere nobody needs anything from us for a few hours. An hour later the private jet climbed smoothly above the clouds while Lily sat curled beneath a blanket near the window staring down at the endless sea of white beneath them. Daddy, she whispered sleepily, the sky was waiting for you. Ethan looked out across the bright horizon. Without answering right away. Beside him, Vivian rested quietly in the leather seat across the aisle, watching sunlight spill across the cabin walls. There was no performance left in her now. No billionaire armor. Just a tired woman slowly remembering what kindness felt like. After a long silence Ethan finally looked at her. Why did you come back that night? Vivian lowered her eyes briefly before answering. Because I was standing beside a Rolls Royce, she said softly, and I had never felt more alone in my life. Ethan understood that answer more than she realized. He glanced toward Lily sleeping peacefully beside the window with one small hand resting against her airplane drawing. Then he looked back at Vivian. "You are not alone anymore." Vivian's eyes shimmered slightly at those words, but this time she did not hide it. Outside the jet windows, morning sunlight flooded the clouds in gold so bright it almost looked endless. And somewhere high above the world below, three lonely people quietly began becoming a family.